I was introduced to this world on June 11th, 1928, at the Unity Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. My mother, Ida, was a homemaker, and my father, Aaron, was a tailor. I was the eighth of the Wagner siblings, and as such, I came to be the end of the line, and my mother had no more children after me. My two older sisters were married and lived in their own apartments, Jean and then Ethel. And then from then on it became my sister Gertrude, my sister Vivian, my brother Joe, my sister Blanche, and my sister Dottie. And then there was me. But I was almost 2 years. My sister Jean gave birth to my nephew Teddy, and he was, very close in age to me, and we grew up together. Unfortunately, early in my life, when I was 2.5, my father Aaron had a tragic accident coming home from a lodge. He was made vice president, and he stepped off the curb and he got hit by an off-duty policeman. And at 2.5, I was fatherless. I gotta say, all my life I missed not having a father, but you gotta do with what you've got. And I found out that the family hired an attorney to litigate the accident, and when the court case came up, my mother carried me in, went through the proceedings, and in the end, she was awarded $5,000, and that's what her life was worth in 1930. However, she managed with what she had, and everybody had to pitch in and do their thing. My brother had to come back from Ohio University, get a job, and then go to City College at night. And then my sister Gertrude, my sister Blanche, they ended up getting work to bring in money so that the family could keep going. And going we did. My mother always had food on the table, and we always had a house in good shape. And I gotta say, she is my hero and will always be a hero to me for what she did, bringing up the 6 of us that were left after my father passed away. With all her responsibilities, my mother had my youngest sister, Dottie, take care of me, so she took me out of the house when she went with her friends. And I'll always remember my mother saying, "Dottie, take Herbie." And she could not complain because nobody complained to my mother. And along I went, and she always held my hand, and wherever they went, I went. Well, my mother came from Europe, from Brode, Austria, in the late 1800s, and she came over when she was 16 years on basically a steamship, and it was, a rough going. And when she got to U.S., there were some family members here already, and of course she didn't speak the language, but she was a good seamstress, and so she was able to get work as a seamstress in Manhattan. And soon after she got here, she met my father, and they were married. I remember on Friday night, it was sure you're going to have chicken soup and you're going to have chicken. And of course, my mother always benched candles and said the prayers, and we all, stood in attention and listened to her. My mom called me Chaim Hesh, which was my name, was Herbert Harry. So Herbert was Chaim and Harry was Hesh, Chaim Hesh. And that was what she called me. My grandmother came over from Europe, and so did my grandfather. But he couldn't get along with the way things were in this country. And he just had to go back, which he did. My grandmother stayed, and she shared time with my mother's sister in Lower East Side, and then other times she moved in with us.
Do you wish you had asked her more questions about Europe?
Oh, I sure do, and I miss that. Well, I tell you, growing up in the tail end of the Depression, there wasn't much money for toys or anything to entertain yourself. So a lot of times I made my own games, and I made a baseball game with marbles and a board, a backboard, and we played a lot of what we call punch ball. Played in a smaller area, and you punched the ball with your hand, and then you had to run the bases.
Is that on a court or just
Yeah,
out
we
the
had a
street?
big area on the sidewalk outside of some stores, and this big area was big enough we could play the punch ball there. When I was a young lad, I was able to get a paper route to deliver the Brooklyn Eagle, and I went into the apartment buildings and had to walk from floor to floor, and I could handle that easy. And in addition to that, I also got the Saturday Evening Post. I was selling that on the street. My sister Gertie, who was the third in line, was a very special lady. She had great talent for drawing and for art in general, and she's also a wonderful person to help other people that were less fortunate. She was a fashion designer, and she was designing clothes that are in today's marketplace. She was way ahead of herself in the fashion field, and of course I was quite young at the time, and I didn't have too much to do with her, but she was special. Always be special in my mind. She was a fundraiser and managed to raise a lot of money for the Jewish home that she was involved with, and she was good at that. And unfortunately, she died soon after she gave birth to my niece Arlene. It was terrible, it really was. She had a disease at the time that today it wouldn't have been a problem. She had to keep getting blood transfusions, and each time you had to have $5 to put in to make the next transfusion. And everybody would, whatever they had, they chipped in. At my bar mitzvah, I studied at the Sharazadic on Kingston Avenue. When the time came for the bar mitzvah, there were 3 bar mitzvahs that day. And I was looking at my area where the family would have been, and there was no one there. And I looked at the other 2, and they had a good part of their family already in. And, it was getting to the point where I was going to be going on soon. And then, of course, the doors opened, and they flocked in, and they just made it in time. But we were never known for being the first, but we did get there. We celebrated in a backyard we had at the time. We were renting on Lincoln Place, and my mother made lox, gefilte fish, and other delicacies, and we all managed to do well with what was available. I was in PS 167. It was at the time we didn't have bus service, so we had to walk to school, and at the end of the school session we had to walk home again. And I managed through 8th grade, and then I went and took a test to get into Brooklyn Technical High School, majoring in aeronautics. The teenager, we all had things to do, and when we'd meet in the evenings, we would be at an ice cream parlor. A lot of the girls came down. That was the meeting place. We had a lot of friends there. I remember the ice cream parlor was always packed with kids. My nickname became Wiggy, and I know my sister Blanche was called Waggy by her friends, and so we had a Wiggy and a Waggy. That's Teddy.
And that's
That's me. And that's Phyllis. She married Al Fisher, a good friend of mine. And this is Jerry and Belle.
What's their last name?
Marcus. And that's Ronnie. And that's my brother Joe. And that's my nephew Teddy. And that may be one of Joe's children. Billy, it
That's
could be
Uncle
Billy.
Joe?
That's Joe, yeah.
Oh, and who's in the back?
Well, in the back you got Adolf and Jean. And you got my mother, and that's Pearl. That's Joe's wife. I ended up getting work in the mountains, the Jewish Alps they called it, and I worked at different hotels. I was a waiter, and I did get some very nice money from that, and I used to send my mother a mail order every couple of weeks, so she'd have the money to use to keep the family going.
How old were you when you were up in the mountains?
Well, I wasn't like a teen. I probably was in high school at the time. So it was summer vacations, and of course that's when I had the chance to go up there. And I went up with some of my friends, but they didn't last long. I stayed the full season, and I made sure I made as much money as I could. And I did that for a few years. My sister Dottie married my brother-in-law Jack ahead of my sister Blanche. And at one point, it was just my sister Blanche, myself, and my mother, and we lived on Crown Street. And then Blanche met Jack Brothers, and she got married. Then it was just mother and I myself. I was introduced to Broadway maintenance by my brother-in-law Jack. He was instrumental in getting me every job that I ever had. I'll never forget how much he was interested in seeing me do well. When I finished 7 years with Broadway maintenance, I also completed 7 years of evening school at Brooklyn Polytech. And so when I graduated, they drafted me, and I was taken into service in August of '54. Prior to going into service, I met my wife, Rita.
Hello, it's nice to meet you. My name is... But I was born. My parents were Ethel and Nat. For the first few years of my life, we lived fairly near my grandmother's house, and my mother and I spent a lot of time there in the afternoon. My father was a traveling salesman, and he was not around that much, so my mother had the free time to visit. Unfortunately, when I was about 5 years old, my parents' marriage fizzled and they got a divorce. And at that time, my mother and I moved in with my grandmother. And at that point, Grandma became my mother. I called her Grandma, but I thought of her as Mother. She was a lovely woman, very capable, very smart. She had come over here as an immigrant at about the age of 12, as far as I know. She was from Austria. Just where in Austria, I really don't know. And her family decided they wanted to move to America, the Golden Land, America. My grandmother's father did not like America. He still liked life over in Austria, and he went back. But one sister, her oldest sister, who she looked up to and adored, Surachana, was married to a wealthy man. They had a son, and they decided, no, they're going to stay in Austria. Nothing's going to happen to them. Unfortunately, whoever stayed there perished in the camps they had. She did go to school here, so she was well read, spoke beautifully, had never had any kind of an accent, and she often helped me with my homework, and so did my grandfather. He was a wonderful man. Now, Grandpa was really not my real grandpa, which I didn't know till years later, because unfortunately my mother's father died soon after she was born. And my grandmother met Sam Meyerson, married him, and he had 2 children, Rose, my Aunt Rose, and George, who unfortunately passed away at the age of 18. And then was my mother. And then together they had Arthur, who was a half-brother to each of them. And when Arthur was a teenager, as around the time that I moved into Grandma's house, and Arthur was, I loved my Uncle Arthur. He had a beautiful voice. He could have been an opera singer. He had such a wonderful voice. And he always danced with me, picked me up and danced around with me. I was very, very fond of him. He had a sense of humor. He was like an actor. They went to the Jewish theater a lot. As I got older, they took me with him so that I got to see a lot of Jewish plays. I didn't know what they were saying, but they were laughing and they were crying. And the audience loved it, so I loved being there with Grandma and Grandpa and going afterwards out to a restaurant, a kosher restaurant on the Lower East Side, which was a big treat. Of course, in those days, we didn't eat out. My grandmother made a meal every single night, and a couple times a year we went out to eat. While my grandma spoke English perfectly, she also occasionally would speak to my grandpa in Yiddish, so I should not understand what they were talking about. But I was always able to surmise from the gist of what they were saying, what they were talking about. My grandmother was besides being wonderful at everything else, she was a wonderful cook and baker. She made the best apple pie I've ever had in my life. I still haven't had one that's quite as good as hers. And she made holidays every year, every holiday. She made everything herself. They didn't have the greatest refrigeration in those days, but she managed to make everything in a couple days. And Grandpa conducted the Seder, every word. He wouldn't leave out one single word. Oh, but he'd like to sing, well, he was singing, it's a kalte Wintersnacht. And it's like they would do in the Yiddish theater. He'd pull up his coat and say, it's a kalte Wintersnacht, the cold winter's night. He'd always make us laugh. He would come home from work. He'd always have candy for me in his pocket. He'd come along, I'd see him coming up the street, I'd run to him because I knew he had candy. And he used to sit with me, he used to draw pictures for me of like a Charlie Chaplin guy with a cane over his arm. When he and his grandmother bought this house on Clara Street, he and some of the other men, they were all new, there was a new neighborhood that was going up, they got together and bought one of the houses and made a synagogue out of it. Holidays, yes, I would sit with not with my grandma, but with my grandpa. I was a child, I was allowed to sit with him. Grandma was upstairs. Every Friday night's dinner, without fail, was soup and chicken and brisket, and there was always sauerkraut on the table, and a bread, a challah. She made everything. She didn't make it days before and freeze it. She made it that day, and the house was filled with the nice smells of soup and chicken and brisket. Grandpa always had his schnapps with his seltzer. The seltzer, by the way, my grandmother did not shop for. The seltzer man came and delivered the seltzer, as did the milkman. He came and delivered the milk, as did Dugan's Cupcakes, delivered us cupcakes. And if you had clothes to give away or to sell, old clothes, you'd hear someone every so often come down the block, buy old clothes, buy old clothes, I buy old clothes. And you'd know to go outside if you knew he was coming. And you had some old things to get rid of and maybe give you $2 or whatever. What I remember more than the lit candles, I remember her cleaning the candlesticks. Those brass candlesticks had to shine just so all the time. It was part of a set. with candlesticks and a tray and a steisel. In that steisel where that stood in the hutch, in the kitchen area, in the dinette, there was like a nice dinette. It was a lovely apartment. Where were the keys? They're in the steisel. What did you do with the such? It's in the steisel. Everything, you have to know where to put it, in the steisel. But the steisel is a mortar and pestle, which you would grind nuts and things like that. In this household, it wasn't used so much for grinding nuts. It was for holding on to different little things that you didn't know where to put it, that you needed to find it. And that was like the hub of the house. It was in one place. Everybody used that telephone. Besides, we had a party line. So many times you were ready to make a call, pick up the phone, you hear somebody else talking. You had to wait a while, then come back again and try again, see if they were finished. There was no privacy to sit anywhere and talk. You said what you had to say and get off the phone. And as far as entertainment, we had a nice big radio, and we'd sit around listening to that radio, to Lux Theater, to The Lone Ranger, to any number of shows that you sat and you pictured what they were saying, and it was just as entertaining. I did see my father. He often would come and pick me up and take me to see my cousins, because he had 3 sisters who lived in Laurelton in houses side by side. Each one had 4 children, and to me that was an ideal way to live. But at any rate, my dad would take me to see them, and very often he'd leave me there, and I'd have a choice of which house I wanted to sleep in. Most of the time I chose one of the boys, because I liked the boys from the time I was very young. And that was my Aunt Sadie, and she had a daughter, Pearl, who was an older teenager at the time, and I just idolized her. They all played piano. They were all very good piano. They all had baby grand pianos, and of course I wanted one when I got married someday. Then also, as I got a little older, I was more interested in being with my cousin Carol, who was he was 2 years older than I was. And sometimes my father would pick up Carol and my cousin Ronnie, with whose house I like to stay at, and he would take us to the beach. I always had a lot of friends. I was very lucky in that. I had friends that lived on my block, even when I was really young. Not necessarily in my class, but whoever was outside, we played together. Whatever we played stoop ball, we played hopscotch, we played jump rope, we were in the gutter, we didn't have to worry about cars coming, but that was our playground right outside our house. I loved school because that I felt good about myself, because I was good in school. And I always had a boyfriend. I was 7 years old, and Stuart Beckerman came with his hair slicked back with a bobby pin, and he wanted to take me to the movies. And my grandmother says, "Come back when you're old." She was always protecting me from the guys back when I was 7. Once I was a little older and was in school, I made some good girlfriends. And at that time, maybe we were 12, 13 years old, we formed a club. And we each took a nickname. And my nickname was Ricky. My Hebrew name is Rivka. Yeah. Oh, I was Ricky. And I was always like kind of the president there. And we were a very exclusive club. We didn't let anybody in. We had I don't remember how, I would say we had about 8 or 9 with my friend Eleanor. She was like my best friend. As I got into older teenagers, and Carol and I became a little friendlier. So when it came time when she was getting married, who should be her maid of honor, she gave it to her younger cousin Rita.